Okay, thanks very much. Hi, everybody. The work that I work in on parenting is all about public engagement, because what we're trying to do is to change the way that parents parent. We're trying to upskill parents to cope with their children's behavioural difficulties. And the Parenting and Families Research Group at Manchester has been working on lots of different ways of engaging parents with parenting programmes. So we do lots of randomised controlled trials to see if different sorts of parenting intervention work, but we're very, very conscious of how important it is to get parents actually using these sorts of programmes. I work with Matt Sanders, who's based at the University of Queensland and also has a visiting chair here. And we worked in 2006, we were involved in a television series, an evaluation of the impact of that television series. And it demonstrated an evidence-based parenting programme called Triple P. So families who went through that programme on TV were an example of how the Triple P positive parenting programme, which is a very good evidence-based programme, works. What we wanted to know was whether watching Driving Mum and Dad Mad on TV actually changed parenting in parents who watched a television series, just normal television series. I'm just going to show you a clip so you know what I'm talking about. This is one of the ITV adverts for it. There.
Every time you tell your children, no, don't stop it, you should be saying 4 positive things to them.
No! That's not nice, is it?
1 week in and the hard work begins. Children just glow when you give them good praise. But with kids like these,
Stop swearing.
even the best intentions can go to waste.
Things that make it actually happen.
Driving Mum and Dad Mad, the new series continues tonight at 9, ITV1.
Okay, so Driving Mum and Dad Mad was aired on television. We did a piece of research alongside it with parents signing up. We had several hundred parents who took part. We saw that their parenting changed. The impact case was about what happened to that information next. And although this is a very public domain piece of work, it's actually incredibly difficult. I was interested in reading the REF panel's feedback on the whole REF process for our unit of assessment, where he said the narrative case study largely succeeded in capturing the complex links between research and impact, which I think, oh, sorry. Stop. Family's got better, by the way. So what we did in the impact case was there was a piece of research that we wrote up from that study. The information, some of that video footage went into an internationally used parenting programme that became Triple P Online. So there were clips from that went into the online process, into the online Triple P, and the research helped to provide an evidence base for Triple P Online. We knew that it was having an impact because Triple P Online and the video material from that television series ended up being used with approximately 7 million parents internationally. So clearly the information got out there and had an impact. It was demonstrating it and getting it into a REF impact case that was the really, really difficult bit. And I printed, before I came over here, I printed off version 22 and I was looking at that still has comments on it saying, can you prove this? And I was looking at the sort of evidence that we came up with. So we had, for example, I said the materials reached 7 million families. So the question was, well, how can you prove that? And so I'd got the Triple P International website giving information about the study. We've got the training material that Triple P was using for using the resources. We got a corroborating letter from the managing director. We had information from that television series appearing on Glasgow's website, where they were doing a big parenting programme. corroborating letter from the director of the Troubled Families Programme, which was a government organisation, saying, and I've got the notes down here and the little kind of boxes down the side, where they haven't got the source for this. Joe Tuke confirms the government commitment to the area, but says they do not have records that enable him to say more about recent developments. So really, I think the message I would take from all of this, and the other thing is, clear impact. I get invited to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime to talk about parenting and using parenting approaches to prevent families, young people progressing into using drugs and crime. And whenever there's a big presentation, they say, will you come along and show one of the clips from the series? It's absolutely brilliant. And when you've got a director of a major drugs programme, an international agency like that, saying, please come and show that, and then saying to everybody listening, we know that these parenting programmes work, implement them internationally. It's just obvious they're having an impact. So he was able to write a letter saying that. Even so, it felt like a real uphill slog trying to demonstrate that this work was having an impact. So I guess the tips that I would take from this would be document what you're doing all the time. Just document. Get somebody to email you something that says, you know, I'd particularly like you to use this because, or I found that really helpful because, so that you can give a really strong evidence trail of how your work has had an impact. I'm very happy to take questions. I don't know what format you want to run with, but
I thought maybe we'd
say
try to do
more.
all the presentations first.
That's absolutely fine, yeah.
There's a couple of short questions. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think maybe it's easier just to run through.
Yes,
and then
okay,
maybe do all
on to the next.
questions at the
Yeah.
end, if that's
Fine, yes. Okay.
Very well. Hi, I'm Tim, and my impact case was a collaboration with the War Museum in Salford Quays. There, you've probably seen the building. If not, in the back of the 9 o'clock news or the regional news, you can see it sitting there on Salford Quays. And I came at this from work that I do predominantly on political violence, predominantly in Turkey, where there has been intermittent truces between the Kurdish, predominantly Kurdish anti-state forces and the Turkish state since I started working there in the early 1990s, mid-1990s. So the idea of the truce, this kind of truce idea, came from the Cultural Olympiad. And I didn't know this at all, but apparently in the Peloponnesian Wars, when the Olympics began, there was a truce that between Peloponnesia and whoever else they were fighting, Sparta probably, and there was a cessation of violence in order to hold the Olympic Games. And so when the modern Olympic Games were recreated 100 years ago or so, they reintroduced this kind of as part of the Cultural Olympiad, this notion of truce. And the War Museum applied for and got a large grant, about £500,000, to host the truce aspects of the Cultural Olympiad for the London Games in 2012. So I got asked to be involved in that after I wrote an article in the Manchester Evening News here. I never had any intention for this to ever be a ref case. I didn't even think of that at all for years, actually, until I met Chris at the back here, our ref coordinator, who told me it might be quite a good ref case. And then we went on and worked on it together. So the exhibition itself had two elements. The first is in the Lambeth Palace here, the Lambeth Museum in London, the big war museum. That's a gallery there, and in that we had a number of interactive AV displays and a big film that showed for 10 minutes. In the Manchester and the Salford Museum, we developed that film, shot that film, and showed it on what they call a big picture show, which I don't know if you've ever been to the museum, but is shown in the main auditorium every day with 20-odd projectors, and it's supposed to be quite disorientating. We spent around £55,000 on appointing a audiovisual consultancy firm that had been known for doing music videos before, actually, for Badly Drawn Boy and Snow Patrol and groups like that. And they were a kind of interesting bunch to work with in the former mill that they occupy in Salford. And together we developed this kind of film and the interactive AV that go with it. And my role really was to try and guide the intellectual content, the intellectual project behind the film. And that was to really try and problematize the notion of truce and peace. And I wanted to get people to understand that peace is not simply the absence of war, first and foremost. It contains notions of justice. Secondly, international peace efforts commonly disregard local preferences and commonly follow international agenda. And then thirdly, disarmament and so on, and these kind of peace-building processes are not simply about turning swords into plowshares. It's much more complex than that. There's real challenges around demobilization, disarmament, people give in their guns, receive some money, go and buy better guns. That's a common practice. So I wanted to interject some kind of critical insight into the idea that peace is a self-evidently good thing. So what we did then, and much like my previous speaker, we had some difficulties in demonstrating impact here. And so really there's a three-stage process that we came up with Chris here. And that was that you do the work initially. You have your research, that's the first thing. You then engage with someone else, but then you need to demonstrate not only that people have connected with that work, but also then they have done something with that as a response. And it's that final stage that's actually quite difficult to show. So yes, we could show that 300,000 people came to our exhibition. That was easy with footfall measures and admission tickets and so on. But what did they do with this information? So we applied to the university and we got a small grant to appoint a consultant to basically stop and interview people as they left our exhibition, our films. And we came up with, crunched some numbers, and we came up with some data that showed that people were reporting that they had changed their minds a little bit in some small ways. Our consultant interviewed around 350 people, and we got some statistically significant evidence to show that they had changed their mind, changed their opinion in some way. That's very important for the REF criteria we found. We also got wanted to show kind of elite impact or get corroboration from the great and the good, and we had some of those. We got Conrad Bailey, who was someone big in the FCO, to launch our event in London. We got Sebastian Coe, who chaired the Olympic Committee, as you know, to write something nice about our work. We got the head of the museum, Graham Boxer, over there to, again, write something nice. He's from Conciliation Resources, and he's from the Red Cross, the International Committee of the Red Cross. And we invited those two guys to a final kind of summing up event in London in September 2013, after the Games. And we got them then to write reviews. That's Catherine from the War Museum, who actually did 90% of the work and really ran the project at that end. In terms of legacy, finally, I continued to work with Catherine. We did one of Faculty of Humanities' first MOOCs, massive open online courses together on humanitarianism that launched last year. We're running that again next year. And now I'm a member of the War Museum's sort of academic guidance committee. So there's an ongoing role there. I think that's it. My brief was 5 to 10 minutes. Hopefully I crept in time.
I'm conscious that both yourself and Rachel are a bit pressed for time, so maybe if we take some questions for Rachel and Tim now before we move on to the other two presentations, would that be a plan?
Yeah, I have to teach it too. I'm sorry about that.
No, that's
Yeah.
fine.
Earning a living for the university.
A question for Rachel or Tim, or a comment? Chris. Maybe I'll start just here.
I can ask Tim how your impact case was received.
Well, I don't know. You know,
Sorry,
how the impact case was received. Yes, I don't know because we submitted in our unit assessment quite a number. 5 was it, Chris?
4.
4.
There were 3 4-stars and 1 3-star, but we have no idea of knowing the 3-stars.
Yeah, definitely not mine. But apart from that, I really don't know because the comments were sort of generic to all 4. But they received well, right, Chris? The comments were good, I think.
The comments were very good.
Yeah.
So conveniently enough, I now have the microphone. The evaluation you did, for what purpose was it originally? Was it something the DCMS required? Because I'm interested to know how the evaluation fed into the REF process. These are often not initiated by the REF process, are they?
Consultancy that we got. Yeah, no, it wasn't by the DCMS, the funders, the government funders of the... No, we got separate funding from the faculty for that in order to try and approach this kind of final stage of REF analysis, which is finding out not only demonstrating that you had an impact on the museum, and but actually you had a kind of measurable impact on the clients of the museum. So there was a kind of a final stage of change that you had to demonstrate. So I think that was, I mean, I would think that was fairly crucial because, of course, you could do something very high profile, but it wouldn't necessarily change any minds or have any impact on the world around you. So I think that was vital, and it was a relatively small amount of money that we paid a freelance consultant to go and stand there for a few days and interview people. And I think well worth it, actually. Got really good value for that, I think.
I've got a question for you. I've got a question for you as well. I don't think it is, you know. So well, I did an impact case on public engagement as well, and I was asked about the long-term impact. So because what you're describing is instant feedback. They've seen an exhibition, it's their instant response to it. Were you able to capture long-term impact? Because I found this very hard because I'm not a social scientist and it's not my research project to follow people up for 5-10 years.
Yeah, no, we weren't asked that. No, we were, I mean, the project began in 2009 and then it was completed in September 2013. So I guess there's a kind of longitudinal aspect to that by itself in terms of my overall engagement as a publicly funded academic with a local museum. I think you can trace out how my collaboration with them changed over time, I suppose, and how they received my impact, they received my input and so on. But with the program changing in September, coming to an end in September 2013, which of course is relatively close to REF submission date anyway, we couldn't actually do anything more than that. I suppose we could, I mean, the film is still showing at 2 o'clock every day, people, if you're interested, in the museum. So you could go back now and do an evaluation, and it'd be interesting to correlate that to current affairs. So I don't know, with the rise of Daesh in Iraq or something, you might find that public opinion has changed. But none of that was carried out because the REF curtain kind of fell just as the project ended.
You generated a narrative in that case around you changing the practice of the museum they could take forward into
Oh, that's true, yes. Well spotted, Chris. Yeah, we did write a paragraph on how the museum was developing its strategy in relation to my great wisdom. Yeah.
So I have a question for both of you really about the difference between reach, footprint and website hits, if you like, and then the consequence of that reach. And I think you talked about statistical significance and you've talked about sort of, it's made an impact because. So is there any advice you'd give with regards to sort of that impact of the reach, if you like, rather than the reach itself? And I'm particularly interested, and I don't know if Chris would want to comment on this, about the numbers with regards to the reach. Because again, you could influence one person that creates an enormous impact, or you could influence lots of people who create very little impact. So do you have any particular views on that? Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, that's a really good question. If we go back to the contact with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, they invited me back about a month ago, and they said they're developing a video which is going to be used at a General Assembly of the United Nations, which they want to demonstrate the power of positive parenting. And what they want to do in advance of that is develop a video that can be sent out internationally. And they asked me, showing off here, but they asked me on the basis of this research, because they were saying what you've been able to do is to influence parents using the media. We want to create a video that will influence parents, but we really want to influence the people who are the policy makers. So they're picking up on that research, and you can kind of track it through to them actually doing something with it now. I mean, how many... That's one person inviting me, but I don't know how many people that will reach, but the chances are it will be big, but very, very hard to measure.
But it's that knock-on effect, isn't it?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. I think, I mean, that was really, we were able to demonstrate sort of reach in terms of numbers because the museum gets 1.3 million visitors a year, both sites, or it's 4 sites in total actually, but mainly on the big 2. But that's why at the end then we thought it was clever to invite people to a final summing up and then use those people as cooperative referees. So they were kind of grateful anyway that we paid for them to come over and fed them and so on. And then we wrote to them, this was the previous slide, particularly these two sort of senior NGO, these are the kind of the leader of Conciliation Resource, founder of Conciliation Resources, and the corporate spokesman for ICRC. So kind of big, important people. And then we fed them a form of words in the letter that we sent them. We said, oh, it would be terrific if you were able to say something like that about us. So then they said that for us because they were, being nice to us. And then similarly with Conrad Bailey, who we had real trouble with because he wasn't really interested in getting involved. I mean, he came and launched us and was very kind, actually, but then just ignored all our emails and telephone calls. But we did eventually track him down, and we did eventually get something from him saying something like the Build the Truth project was a good thing, and it influenced the way I think about the world, something like that. So you can get kind of elite reach here as well, and try and show impact with kind of decision makers.
Thank you. So persistence pays off. Yes.
Yeah, he was a real challenge. Yeah, Conrad Bailey. Yeah.
Any other questions?
That's it.
Thanks very much. I'm curious to hear a bit from each speaker about the underpinning research and how the impact emerges from it.
The underpinning research is that traditionally parenting interventions are delivered face-to-face, either individually or in groups. That's what tends to happen. They tend to be delivered through services, the NHS, social services and so on. And what we were demonstrating was that you can influence parents directly using a media-based approach that didn't involve any human contact at all. So the whole thing was done through a web-based intervention, or web-based data collection based on watching a television series. And so we'd randomised people to either watching the television series or watching the television series and having additional resources that backed up the information in the television series. And we found a significant improvement across the board with parents, but also an enhancement for parents who'd had the additional resources. So we were able to argue that having online resource and media material could actually replace the need for that one-to-one or group-based human contact. So that's how it led then into a case for Triple P online. Yeah.
Oh, I've got that. Oh, yeah. So there's a couple of aspects to the research, I mean, that we wanted to get across, really. I mean, I think my research showed, particularly in Turkey but elsewhere, that my research showed that truces are often periods simply to regroup militarily. So a truce can be sold to the public as a great sort of progressive peace-building thing, but in reality, the forces just use that period for their own strategic advantage. And then secondly, the idea of peace as an absence of violence ignores any aspect of social justice. So you, as a mediator, you could go into a war situation, reduce violence intensities, often between with asymmetric forces, very powerful, very weak. You reduce violence intensities. Whose interests are you acting in? I mean, clearly you're acting in the side of the powerful, whose interest it is to have non-violence and continue being powerful. So I wanted the film to capture some of this complexity and get people to come away thinking, well, actually, peace is much more than just a cessation of violence, and we live in such a grossly unequal world that perhaps behavioural violence is more morally complicated than I thought. So to do that, we filmed all sorts of people in interviews. We projected these interviews up, and we intercut this with a lot of reportage footage. So we had a lot of footage from Sierra Leone, from El Salvador, but we also were very keen not to make this just about other people's wars. So we had some really interesting two former combatants from Northern Ireland who talked extensively about what truce and peace meant for them and the kind of difficulties that actually it had brought the Republican movement in particular over there. So, I mean, it's a reasonably abstruse and really reasonably complex kind of set of ideas to get across in a 10-minute film. And I think the museum was really quite brave in tackling that, rather than the more simple messages it has elsewhere, perhaps. But hopefully it was, reasonably effective, that people came away thinking, it's more complicated than I thought. Although, of course, the British reading, we had to work to an average reading age of 12, which is apparently Britain's the average reading age in the UK is that of a 12-year-old. So everything we had to do had to be in that frame. So it's a real challenge, that, actually. And maybe I think we went higher than that, hoping that people would catch its subtleties.
Are there any more pressing questions for Rich or Tim before we go to the next speaker?
I'm George Brooke, and I'm the Professor of Biblical Criticism and Exegesis, which we had correctly pronounced, which is great. My main research interest is the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Manchester, for over 70 years now, has had a research profile in the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are Jewish documents found in caves since the Second World War. Manchester is the only university, in fact it's the only institution in the UK to have some actual fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and these formed part of our impact case study. I was also a REF sub-panel member, so I was kind of put in the stocks on all fronts for trying to manage this impact case study, and then trying not to hear my colleagues talk about it on the panel. We decided that because of the diversity of the research involving the Dead Sea Scrolls at Manchester over a long period of time, that we would not present a single form impact case study, but have 3 dimensions to the case study. 2 were indirectly connected to our research, and 1 was directly connected. The 2 indirect ones were to do with the public imagination, museum exhibitions, and popularizing our scholarly research on the scrolls. And here I think it's important to just say that I think accident and serendipity are really important aspects of how we produce impact case studies. It just so happened that during the impact period, a major exhibition was held in the United States, and the lead exhibit in the main hallway in the museum in Minnesota was a quotation from this book, which I had written. So there was a big quotation with my name under it, and this was the bestseller in the museum bookshop. It happens just to have been published in paperback in a revised form in 2011. It came out originally in 2002. So for public imagination, we used the publisher's sale figures for this book, which were just topped 100,000, in order to demonstrate that we were having impact not in changing people's minds who might read the book, because that is almost impossible to verify, but in allowing Thames and Hudson probably to employ a single person on the basis of the money they're making out of this book. So we use publisher statistics as our evidence for this public imagination aspect of the case study. The second aspect was simply to try to demonstrate the significance of the research overall, which was that 2 of us in the Department of Religions and Theology have given advice over many years to all kinds of funding bodies about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Obviously we had to look for some advice that we had given to funding bodies outside the higher education sector. And in fact, again, through serendipity, just during the period of impact, 2 of us had been involved in writing a very major report for a foundation for a multi-million-pound investment in the building of a new museum in another country. And our report was instrumental in the decision-making process of that foundation. We had to present this in the impact case study anonymously. And this is accepted by REF sub-panels, at least in the 2014 process. There were impact case studies involving cabinet committees. And it was agreed that these kinds of case study could produce anonymous evidence, and you wouldn't have to be anxious about that. And the third part of the case study was to do with the Manchester fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Again, a bit of serendipity. I actually was responsible for bringing these fragments to the Rylands Library, and we've done some work on them in combination with various research folk. The team of ophthalmologists at the University of Cardiff, and a large team of scientists in Berlin. But we ourselves did some research here in Manchester involving me scrounging free downtime on the synchrotron in Daresbury, which is affiliated to the university. In fact, this part of the case study was audited by the REF sub-panel because they wanted to have a little bit further clarity about where the research, the underpinning research, was actually done at Manchester. Wasn't it done at Cardiff, or wasn't it done at Berlin? And luckily we were able to demonstrate that some of the very early publications of the scientific evidence, the scientific analysis of the scroll fragments, had been done at Daresbury, and we had some early articles which were actually produced by the Slovenian National Library, because I was put forward to represent the north of England in the launch of the House of Lords Heritage Conservation Report in 2008 at Tate Britain. And that was just, again, a little bit of serendipity, and it happened that the director of the National Museum Slovenia was in the audience, and he wanted my paper in his journal because of what it said about heritage conservation. The really important thing about this third aspect of the case study was that in light of the scientific research done on the fragments, the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, very luckily just before the reporting date deadline, decided to have a little conference on the exhibition of very fragile manuscripts from antiquity. And the Manchester fragments were held up as the primary evidence for the decision it took, in light of its own one-day conference, to change its policy on exhibitions. It no longer loans any Dead Sea Scrolls to bodies outside Israel. And this was because of the way in which the Manchester fragments have been able to be analysed in relation to the stress in the deterioration of collagen in the fragments. So hooray, we actually had something we could say was a demonstrable policy change for a beneficiary of our research. Thanks.
Okay. So hi everybody, I'm Max Jones, and I'm lecturer in modern history. And in some ways I think that all these projects are very impacty. And I suppose I'm what I might be able to add today is perhaps a story that offers a model for more low-level academic activity, in that the impact flowed from my doctoral research, which I submitted in 1999, and then the book based on my doctoral research came out in 2003. And then, to repeat a point that George made, partly, I think, through good impact and partly through serendipity, a centenary that I'll mention in a moment, lots of activities followed from the publication of the book. So two things I'd emphasise is that we checked, and even though I continue to work on the topic, which I'll tell you about in a moment, but even though the key book, the monograph, came out in 2003, that was still deemed acceptable as an impact case study. And history had, I think, a 2-star, a 3-star and a 4-star ref case study. And I'm almost certain HECRI, the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute, will have been the 4-star because it's a model of impact. They train Red Cross workers, etc. And I like to think it was a 3-star, so this is sort of preempting the question. I presume you're fairly confident, George, that you were a 4-star. Yeah, you would have thought changing the policy of the Israeli if that doesn't qualify you for 4-star, I'm not sure what did. So, essentially, my doctorate looked at Scott of the Antarctic, the British polar explorer who died on his way back from the South Pole in 1912. And lots of biographies have been written, but no one had asked the question. This guy lost the race to the South Pole to Roald Amundson's Norwegian expedition, and then they all died. And yet he's raised as a hero on the eve of the First World War. Why? What does this tell us about British society? So that was the initial research question. And in some ways, or in the way that I ended up phrasing it in this case study, ended up saying, well, what are the key contributions? What's the significance of the research? So the underpinning research was all conventional archive research, use of new methodologies of cultural history, etc. Very conventional. And the two easiest, well, what's the significance? How are you changing public understanding of this still public figure? Were first rebutting the revisionist who had savaged Captain Scott and essentially said he was an idiot. So I would be classed as a counter-revisionist in a very boring fence-sitting way, saying, you know, he made some mistakes. However, to dismiss him as a complete idiot would be foolish and unsupportable. And secondly, retrieving his scientific research, or rather the scientific research of the British Antarctic expedition of 1910 from neglect. So the great Scott debunker, Roland Humford, said, oh, he wasn't interested in science. This was all a veneer. They're just interested in going out and conquering empire and killing themselves. And actually, they was a huge investment of resource in scientific research of the expedition. So, how did we turn this into the impact case study? Well, the RPE requests started coming round, and I realised that I'd been doing lots of impact, lots of public engagement. And then the centenary of Scott's expedition happened in 1910. They sailed in 1910, and there were a wave of centenary activities through 1910 to 1913. And by then, this is where the time lag comes in, because the book came out in 2003. It was well received. I'd done other things about Captain Scott. I then had a reputation in the field, so I got invited to participate in many, many of the activities involved in the centenary of the exhibition, really from 2010 to 2013. So what sort of activities? Well, I counted them. I think I'm up to about over 30 lectures, public lectures, not academic seminars on Captain Scott now. So the British Library, for example, launched a online edition of Scott's journals, and they invited me to be on a panel and give a lecture to do the launch. The Royal Geographical Society didn't invite me when my book was published, but they did want a Monday night lecture in 2010, and by then I was had the reputation, so they did invite me. They wanted Ranulph Fiennes instead, understandably, in 2003. A TV documentary, a producer approached me, wanted to do a TV documentary. There was some talk they might take me to the Antarctic, and then that died away because it was much better for them to get Ben Fogle to do it. So public lectures, a radio documentary series. Amanda Vickery did a radio documentary on men, and she spoke to me about doing something on the Second World War, and I said, well, why don't you do something on explorers? And she ended up having an episode on explorers in that series. Now, I'm not sure if she could have included it. I'm sure she was an impact case study, because it wasn't really her research. She was, in that case, really being a sort of public intellectual talking head, putting a great series together about men and masculinities. I'm not sure if she included it, but I could include that because I was presenting my research. And I was also able to say, oh, she changed the series and decided to do something on exploration before I'd done it. A couple of people wanted to write plays about Captain Scott, and they approached me to be a consultant. And the Royal Geographical Society then invited me to do a lecture series. They have a regional lecture tour. So I went round the country lecturing about Captain Scott. Finally, the Natural History Museum did a special exhibition about Scott's last expedition, and I was hired as a consultant, and they filmed me in an interview, and so at the end, I'm not sure if anyone did this, but you could go and sit and watch a TV video, and I was one of the talking heads at the end. So the initial stage was, oh, I'm doing all this stuff about Captain Scott and my research. How do you turn it into an impact case study? So I'll just finish then with a couple of points. I was thinking, well, what could I actually say that would be helpful to people taking this on? So this is just some top tips about it. The issue has been discussed is how do you do anything, or in the language of the last ref, reach and significance. So reach was easier because the museum, at least, 80,000 people went through that exhibition. I never got figures for the TV documentary. So one thing I would definitely recommend is if you're engaged in any of these activities now, think first about gathering quantitative and qualitative evidence and plan a strategy. My great regret, which I think has been echoed already, was that I'd done loads of these public lectures, particularly the RGS ones, before I'd thought about it as an impact case study. Questionnaires are very useful, and TIMS, I thought the key would be to actually discuss with the impact team phrasing questions on questionnaires that you can then use to demonstrate significance. So actually, I think coming up with the right questions would be what I will take forward in the future. So I would have, Max's lecture has changed my opinion of Captain Scott, or I now, after listening to Max's lecture, I now think more highly of Captain Scott's scientific research, strongly agree, etc. Again, there's an element of, a little bit uncomfortable, but it generates quantitative evidence, which is useful. So, questionnaires, audience, public lectures is a whole other lecture by me. I use a lot of slides, but I never use bullet points. So, but that's another lecture. Quantify being the questionnaire point. A couple of final things to say before I finish. One thing that I've trained myself to do, and is humiliating, it's embarrassing, is if you're involved, send the email after the event, would you write a testimony for me? And I've got another suggestion, which my colleague Hannah Barker suggested to me. With the appropriate caveats, if they're really busy or don't know what to write, send them some suggested text. And I know that I was very uncomfortable with that, but partly you've got people who are very busy, and partly you've got people who would love to do it, but they don't know what to write because they don't know the academic world. I'm not, of course, saying that you exaggerate, oh, Max is fantastic, but I would write sort of very clear summaries, and most of the time I haven't had to, but on 2 or 3 occasions I have, and that's been useful. And then I've got on record, you must not, please do not approve this or send this if you are uncomfortable or you disagree. So I make sure that there is a official record of the correspondence to show that you're not putting pressure on anybody, putting words on anybody's mouth. But you've got to have the evidence. So testimonies, and then even with people outside academia who don't know what to write, or people who are very busy, I think you can suggest as well with the appropriate caveats so you've got a record. And finally, I went through lots of drafts and the impact team was great, and it was all about, in this other document, tailoring it to the exact wording of the ref. So I've got, as you'll see, those are pathways to impact. And then the reach of Jones's research is Jones's impact is demonstrated through blah, blah, blah. And then the significance lies in 3 major changes to public discourse about Scott. And it went through a lot of drafts, and it was improved immeasurably by the impact, by the input of colleagues and by the impact team. But to a certain extent, that process can't happen until we've got the exact wording from the REF panel. We know generally what it's going to be, but I think that it's where, as we know from writing grant applications, having the exact terminology really helps. Thank you.
Two presentations then. I mean, you both talked about how lucky you were and how fortunate you were, but obviously we all know that you can actually prepare yourself to be serendipitous. Can you just comment a little bit on any strategies that you might have for that?
Well, I think it's really important to give priority to the ongoing quality of your research. And if it happens to turn into having some impact, which can be very obviously dated to within the ref period, that is all to the good, and it's to the benefit of your colleagues. But that's why units of assessment need to have several ongoing possibilities for impact case studies rather than just the 2 that might actually be submitted at the end of the day. But I do think there is a bit of accident involved in this. I mean, I could not have been more fortunate than to have the Israel Museum actually produce a policy document within about 4 months of the deadline of the ref period, which enabled me to demonstrate that. If I'd tried to say, please, you've got to publish this policy document, they almost certainly would have ignored me. So it's a bit of both. But if you've got an ongoing, really high-quality research agenda, that is going to produce ongoing impact. My real worry, and I'm coming up to retirement soon, is that the department will want to use me again because my impact is ongoing. Next week, I'm filming for the Smithsonian. And how's that going to have impact? Yeah, so I think it is an ongoing affair.
I'm good because I've got that.
I think I'd echo what George said in that partly what gets you the public audience is the quality of research, and that's why I wanted to mention that Amanda Vickery series, which is a great series, but I haven't asked her to see because it's not really, you know, her books are about 18th century and various other activities. This was a much more broader piece, which was a terrific piece of BBC radio, but I'm not sure if it would fit the criteria. And for the purposes of the REF, then having that quality research is key. Then in serendipity, partly there is accident. So, you know, if I'd been 10 years, done it all 10 years sooner, I wouldn't have had the centenary to exploit. So I think there is an accident factor. But there are 2 things I think that you can do. First, you can be aware of relevant anniversaries, centenaries, etc., or to put that in a broader frame, aware of the types of events and mechanisms which generate interest beyond the academy. And anniversaries are one of them. And the second one, I think, is also what benefited me, again, not through impact case study design, as I was doing this when impact wasn't really on the agenda and it wasn't being listed in official documents. I just did these things because I enjoyed them. But what I did do was that in the email torrent that we all swim against and try not to drown in, when things came about asking me to give a lecture, oh, would you speak to someone on the phone to do something, then I was always open. And then that does mean these networks beyond you are created because people then realise that you're willing to give some of your time up. And I became very careful, so I was always then having the History Channel had contacted me about something, and I spoke to them for about an hour, and then they said, well, we want to interview, but we're not going to pay you. And I said, well, I presume you're being paid. So, and I thought as a point of principle, you know, you don't get much, but if you're going to be the talking head, I think if it's a charity or a school's activity, then that's fine. So my line now is, look, I'll speak to you for 10 or 15 minutes, I make a decision, and then if it's a commercial venture, then you make a decision about whether you want to participate in it. So I think there are decisions around that, because if it's open-ended, as we know, media organisations will just keep taking. They'll take as much of your free time as you can, and we've got actually activities for our students and for our other partners who we want to get involved in. So, sorry, I'll stop waffling. Just being open and networking and finding the time to engage with those different audiences through the different outlets and not immediately pressing delete.
Thank you.
Anything else, or?
Plan. First thing to do is think about your evaluation and plan it a bit so that it's not an afterthought or a bolt-on. Think about why you're evaluating, what's the purpose of it. So if it's about impact, be clear about why you're doing that. Who are you going to evaluate to access some information about the possible impact you're going to have, and so that you can start to ask the right questions, because Matt's talked about asking the right questions. So if you have a clear purpose and you've planned, you quite often start to ask the right questions. I read a lot of the draft REF impact case studies and commented on quite a few. And one point, my third point then, is try and create a baseline so that you can show what your actual impact is, so that you can show something where the line in the sand is drawn, so that you can then say, well, look, this is the impact I've had, and it's a much stronger story. Thinking about different ways to collect that evidence of impact, think about the people you're working with. If you're working with, like Rachel was, with a group of people, then perhaps you can ask them to be involved in how might be the best way to collect that impact, involve them in that process. If you're working with a museum, for example, they've got huge experience of doing this, perhaps you can work with them as well. If you struggle to know what's an appropriate technique for a particular type of people, look outside our sector. You know, youth workers have to do a lot of impact research and impact evaluation of their work with young people. They've produced lots of guides and resources. So think about who else might be working with that group and see if they've provided help and guidance for their workers, and you can tap into that. And then my last point is a bit linked to almost serendipity, really, but think about the unexpected impact. So what hadn't you planned for that happened, and where's that taken you? And be sort of open your eyes to that as well. So those really are my 5 tips then. Plan, be clear on your purpose, think about a baseline, look for other expertise to help you if you're not sure how to collect that information and data, and don't forget the unexpected.